Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos otra vez.
Hello, good evening to everyone. Welcome once again to this session, The Photography Speaks of Revolution, the series of lectures programmed by the KBR Photography Center in Barcelona of the Fundación Mapfre. This is the sixth talk, and we are crossing the equator. And before we start, I want to thank our team, Cotton, audio visuals and technical stuff. And he is the one who lets me know that I should turn on my mic and things like that. Roger, which is myself, whose interpreting work is very important for all of us. And thank you, of course, to you, to the audience, invisible in this case, online, on these online sessions, for undergoing this revolutionary marathon, and every Tuesday come to hear and see these lectures. We have Paul Goldsmith from California. It's much earlier in California. Good morning, Paul. I hope you have a good day. We've got a pretty bad day here. It's raining in Barcelona, very cold in Madrid. Paul will devote his talk to August 1968, the events that we know as the end of the Prague Spring. Now, I would like to make a small comment. This lecture is the crossing of the equator of our cycle of lectures. We're halfway through it. So perhaps we should not consider a revolution what was really an institutional reform in Czechoslovakia. Maybe we shouldn't call what was a resistance movement from the citizens to the Russians. That was not perhaps exactly a revolution as such. In the European imagination, the pictures of that event in Prague, those pictures have become icons of the struggle for freedom and civil rights, the resistance of the citizens of Prague, together with the resistance of the youth during the spring of that year in Paris. And they tried, and they didn't achieve their goal to change the political system of both countries to a full democracy in the East and the West. And the photographic coverage and the icons that these pictures became are very important. So we've included in our cycle devoted to revolutions, although they were really uprisings or resistance movements, some people think. And we're going to hear Paul's opinion on the events of that summer of 1968 and tell us about his experience, his pictures, and also speak about other authors and photographers that were there at the time. Paul Goldsmith is North American. He was born in San Francisco, California in 1949. He works as a lawyer at a lawyer's office and makes that compatible with his passion for photography. He arrived in Prague with when he was only 19 in the summer of 1968 to get first-hand knowledge of what they called socialism with a human face. And he saw the enthusiasm of the Czech youngsters that he met at the time, and he was witness to the entry to the invasion of the Russian tanks. And the testimonial value of his photography makes it indispensable to understand those events. He's been in many exhibitions, publications. His pictures are in important collections at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and the National Museum in Prague. His pictures and photographs have been collected in the monograph Prague 1968, and they illustrate the book of the famous Czech journalist, Josef Pazderka, on the Russian invasion. Paul will speak in English, but you know that you can follow the lecture in Spanish by resorting to the simultaneous interpreting. I also remind you that in the last 30 minutes, Paul will answer the questions that you send to the chat. That's all, Paul. I'll leave it with you.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It is an honor to participate in this program and to talk to you about my photographs in the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, 53 years ago, and the impact of photography on our view of Prague Spring. The Prague Spring legacy has had a profound impact on history and on my life. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Laura, Carlos Galinet, and Maria Pfaff for inviting me to take part in the Photography Speaks to Revolution, this conference cycle. As you said, I did not become a professional photographer, although I love photography and had early success publishing my Prague Spring works. These photographs stayed in a portfolio for 40 years while I practiced law and raised a family, only to be discovered and seen worldwide because of my introduction to Richard Pivnica, the Northern California Honorary Consul for the Czech Republic. Since the photographs have been recognized and historically and artistically important, in 2018, the 50th anniversary of Prague Spring, I was in Prague to participate in the opening of two shows. One supported at the American Center, supported by the US Embassy, and an outdoor exhibition supported and designed by the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. Here I am in 2018. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, we're coordinated. Okay, 1968, the year of the Soviet invasion, was the year of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. It was a tumultuous year across the globe, and for me personally. At home in the US, we were bitterly divided, with a large part of the population against the war in Vietnam, including me and most of my friends. Protests were frequent. This is a shot from a protest march in Washington, DC. During my gap year between high school and college, I worked for a few months as a merchant seaman on a ship that docked for a week in Saigon, where I saw for myself the napalm-denuded delta as we slowly sailed up the Saigon River. And I also witnessed the chaos, greed, and dispossession of the war. Massive slums of displaced peasants surrounded Saigon, while international businessmen were served drinks and fined food by beautiful Vietnamese girls. Next slide. Next slide, please. '60 was also marked by an upheaval one slide back, please. Was marked by upheaval, protest, and tragedy in the US and around the world. Starting in the early 1960s, the civil war rights movement in the US was being led by Martin Luther King and others, working to create a country where the phrase, all men are created equal, would be a reality. The path to truly integrated society was bitterly fought and often met with violence. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, the day after he gave the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech in support of the Black Memphis sanitation worker strike. In May, massive student protests in Paris vaulted into the news, and France was gripped in chaos, closed universities, and major strikes. Lyndon Johnson was bogged down in a raging controversy over the war in Vietnam, and he declined to run for a second term as president. Robert F. Kennedy entered the race for the Democratic nomination on a peace and justice platform, but was assassinated on June 5th in Los Angeles after a campaign rally. Hubert Humphrey was nominated at a chaotic, violent Democratic convention later that year, and Nixon was elected, and the war dragged on until 1972. I grew up in Marin County, California, across the bay from San Francisco, In 1967, I took off a year between high school and college at the University of California to work and travel. In high school, I was the yearbook photographer, and in my gap year, I always had my camera ready. In February of '68, when I turned 19, I was living on a kibbutz in Israel, moving sprinklers, digging up and replacing irrigation pumps, spraying trees and harvesting pears, potatoes, and sugar beets. In Tel Aviv, I purchased a sky blue Vespa and explored the country, experienced the beauty and incredible history of the Holy Land. Next slide, please. This is my kibbutz, Erez, located in southern Israel, close to Ashkelon and right next to the border with Gaza. Here's a view toward the Mediterranean. To the east is the city of Beersheba, the Dead Sea, and the Sinai Desert. I arrived in December 1967, some 6 months after the Six-Day War. All of the young men from the kibbutz had been called up and participated in the war, some in the bloodiest battles for Jerusalem. Next slide. From Israel, I read the Jerusalem Post and watched with increasing interest the unfolding of Prague Spring and the promising reforms of Alexander Dukchek. In the early summer, there were ominous signs of massive Soviet bloc troops on the border of Czechoslovakia. Prague seemed like the place to be, and I decided to go there on my way back to Luxembourg, where I would catch my flight home to California and to college. Here's one of the many shots of Dukchek and Brezhnev embracing as comrades in better days. In late July, I left Israel and traveled through Greece, Yugoslavia, and Hungary on my Vespa, camping and taking pictures along the way. On August 20th, I arrived in Prague, parked my scooter, and wandered around, admiring the beauty of the city, the bridges, the incredible buildings, and the vibrant cafe and street life. There was a buoyant feeling of optimism and creativity in the air. In a cafe, I met some university students and from Charles University. I was warmly invited to stay in a vacant dorm bed on campus, up by Hradčany Castle. Next slide. Here's some history. The struggle of the creation of Czechoslovakia in 1918 was a culmination of a struggle for ethnic identity and self-determination that had simmered within the multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire since the 19th century. After the Allied victory in World War I, the Allies supported the founding of the independent republic. Then, Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia from 1938 to 1945 during World War II. The Soviet Union liberated the country and soon, after a coup, imposed communist rule, and Czechoslovakia was stuck behind the Iron Curtain for the next 23 years. It was subject to repressive one-party rule, although a persistent group of filmmakers, artists, economists, and intellectuals continued to test the boundaries of central control and give hope that reform was possible. Next slide. In early 1968, Alexander Dukchek was a 47-year-old Communist Party official from Slovakia. He rose in the ranks and emerged as a reformer. In late 1967, he became the first secretary of the Communist Party and then president. He began to institute his vision of reform, to keep Czechoslovakia in the Soviet sphere, but nurture socialism with a human face. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine, April 5th, 1968. Next slide. Life magazine featured photographs showing the optimistic view from the West of Czechoslovakia opening up, beginning to liberalize, reform the economy, and encourage free expression. Dukchek's election unleashed pent-up forces, urging reform, examination of the past, and freedom of expression and of movement. Next slide. Student rallies during Prague Spring were frequent. In the past, such rallies and protests had been brutally repressed. This is another picture from Life magazine. Next slide. Dukchek met with the Russians and the Eastern Bloc countries several times in early '68 in an effort to assure them that Prague Spring was a controlled socialist evolution and not a threat to the adhesion of the Warsaw Pact countries. The hardliners, however, remained unconvinced, and the fate of the reform movement was uncertain. Here's Dukchek in Bratislava with Brezhnev during a gathering of the Eastern Bloc countries, concerned about the potential impacts of the Prague Spring reforms. Dukchek worked to avoid a confrontation and left feeling optimistic. Weeks later, however, late in the evening of August 20th, 1968, a massive invasion of Czechoslovakia was launched by the Soviet Union and its hardline Warsaw Pact allies. Next slide. I awoke early the next morning of August 21st to the rumble of tanks and the sound and sights of full-blown military occupation. I looked out the window of the university dorm room, expecting to see trucks. Instead, I saw Soviet tanks wheeling into position on the campus, blocking all entrances and exits. Despite the optimism of my talk with my new student friends, in the back of my mind, there had been a sense of foreboding based on my knowledge of Soviet troop activity, as well as my experience as a witness to the results of war in Vietnam and in Israel. I was already a cynic at 19 years old. This is one of the first photographs I took that day. What follows is a selection of my pictures taken on the 21st and 22nd of August. Next slide. Without hesitation, I grabbed my backpack, my Nikon F camera, and my last 5 rolls of film and drove my Vespa down to the center of the city. I parked and headed to the area where the confrontation and violence were the most intense, near the radio station. Here we see one of the many young men who leaped onto tanks or tried to confront and block the entering Warsaw troops. Next slide. At times, and on some level, the casualness of the occupiers and the occupied seemed quite ironic, perhaps the result of the juxtaposition of two views. The Warsaw troops thinking they were invited to assist the population, contrasted with the rage and anger of their reception. At the same time, however, you could sense that there was a numbed resignation that came from years of repression and one-party rule, and yet another invasion, this time backed by the overwhelming might of the Soviet Union and their codependent satellites. Actual armed resistance would have been futile. Troops were commonly seen like this, riding on tanks, looking a bit like tourists. Next slide. There was a swirl of activity and violence around the radio station, burning buses, overturned cars, and buildings on fire. Here's the radio station on fire and pockmarked with bullet holes. Next slide. My impulse to record the events was instinctual, and I became emotionally engaged as a participant, as though the assault were happening to my country. I could feel the bewildered outrage, shock, and anger of the population. At the same time, looking into the faces of the young soldiers, I saw people my own age, thrust unwillingly into a confusing occupation that was clearly different from the liberation they were expecting. Next slide. Several people were killed in the pitched battle around the radio station. Here is the smoldering shell of a bus tangled up with a car and truck. Next slide. This photo near the radio station is of a sidewalk memorial to one young resistor killed in the early morning in the heat of battle. Bloodstains, flowers, empty pants, and a hockey stick mark the life lost. Next slide. Here are two portraits. One, a Warsaw Pact soldier, the other a Czech youth, with blood streaming down his head. In my shows, these two always face each other, opposed, but somehow united in their youth. Here's a bandaged young woman looking from Wenceslas Square at the bullet-riddled face of the National Museum. Next slide. This is one of the many impassioned scenes I witnessed of young and old citizens angrily confronting the invading troops to let them know they were not wanted or needed. Next slide. Trucks full of heavily armed soldiers rumbled past the National Museum. Despite the danger, in the faces of these young soldiers, I saw confusion and bewilderment. This is a shot I call Bicycle Boys, taken from the top of Wenceslas Square, showing the entry of invading troops, gathering crowds of protesters and onlookers, while a man in a business suit casually passes by on his way to work. Next slide. Here's a weary occupying soldier leaning on the lid of his tank. Next slide. In a square in front of the Sugar Palace, there was a chaotic confrontation with the occupying troops. A Soviet officer saw me taking pictures and grabbed my camera to smash it. He was momentarily distracted by the angry crowd. I snatched back the camera and ducked into the group, happy to have my camera back and lucky not to have been detained or shot. Next slide. This is the angry crowd that was the distraction, allowing me to retrieve my camera. Next slide. A tank commander with a gun ready in front of the Sugar Palace. As the day moved on, the large tanks took up position, blocking access to Parliament, communist headquarters, and major access points. This tank was in position near Parliament. Next slide. Here's a group of tanks lining the road near party headquarters. Next slide. Here are occupying tanks with white stripes blocking the access to the Czech Central Committee and the Communist Party. Another attempt to communicate. Over 40 years later, when showing my book to a Czech American woman, she recognized this man on the right as her cross-country skiing coach and a Russian teacher. Next slide. This photo shows the sincere discussion and bewilderment I witnessed throughout the day. I did not understand the language, but I knew what was being said. What are you doing here? Go home. August 21st was a rainy day, and the cool air created steam trails behind the lumbering tanks. Next slide. On August 22nd, the second day of the occupation of Prague, crowds of protesters gathered at Nemesti Republiky and marched to Wenceslas Square. Here the crowd confronts a tank, displaying signs in Russian. Why are you destroying Prague? Moscow is your place. Free our government. This is not brotherly help. Here, protesters face off and confront troops outside communist headquarters. Two young men with a burnt flag. It looks like both have broken noses from playing ice hockey. Next slide. The 22nd of August was a day of protest with marches around the city, culminating with a huge crowd in Wenceslas Square. For a photographer, the experience was compelling with a dramatic shot around every corner. There was also a terribly sad, transcendent feeling of the importance of the moment in history, and a sense that I was on a tragic stage, witness to feudal resistance facing the raw power of Soviet force. Amazingly, Jiří Barta, a Czech-American graphic artist in San Francisco, who put together the first edition of my Prague 1968 book, found himself and his brother in this photograph. The day before this picture was taken, Jiří and his brother had come to Prague with a childhood friend who was killed at the radio station by invading forces. Next slide. Here, marchers in front of the National Museum display a blood-stained flag. Here are two views of the sit-down protest in front of the National Museum, which sits at the top of Wenceslas Square. The one on the right is displayed in a museum dedicated to the history of passive resistance at the home of Mahatma Gandhi in Johannesburg, South Africa. The one on the left was published in Newsweek magazine. Next slide. This picture has so many contrasting elements. The clearly overloaded sports car driven by a Bob Dylan lookalike wearing dark glasses, a flag-waving mini-skirted girl, and a tractor in the background. Next slide. Here's a crowded truck displaying placards and flags along with the marchers approaching the head of Wenceslas Square. Next slide. A young protester on the statue of St. Wenceslas, intently looking at the crowd below. Next slide. More marchers with flags. This is one of the last photographs I took on August 22nd. Something about this solitary old man on the cobblestone street with battered walls spoke to me. Perhaps because he had certainly witnessed the founding of the Republic, the upheaval of Nazi occupation, the imposition of communist rule, Prague Spring, and now this invasion. Late in the afternoon on August 22nd, I rode my Vespa out of Prague and toward the West German border. The line of cars and trucks filled with people attempting to leave stretched for miles. But I rode past them to the front of the line, showed my American passport, and was waved through. I drove all night to Frankfurt and to the Associated Press office, where the 5 rolls of films I shot were developed. 5 of my pictures were purchased, and I was thrilled to see them on the front pages of many newspapers, and later that week in Newsweek magazine. I was really broke and desperately needed the money. Next. This photo shows a man overcome with emotion on his knees. Normally the last image of my shows, and one of the last shots I took before leaving Prague. By the time I left Prague on August 22nd, the Soviets had transported Alexander Dukchek and his cabinet to Moscow, where they were forced to capitulate. The repressive old guard who had conspired with the Soviets took over the reins of government. The invasion of 1968 quashed the Prague Spring, and Czechoslovakia would endure 20 more years of political oppression before emerging as a free country. Heroes of the resistance, like Václav Havel, persisted in the face of imprisonment, harassment, and humiliation, and they preserved the ideals of democracy and with creative force built a modern democratic nation. I truly admire and appreciate the struggle, strength, and commitment of the artists, intellectuals, and other citizens who refused to break and managed to prevail through the post-war era until 1989. Next slide. In the aftermath of the invasion, the events were featured in magazines and newspapers around the world. Here's the August 30th, 1968 cover of Life magazine with powerful photographs from UPI and AP taken by other photographers. Next slide. This is one of over a dozen photographs featured in the magazine, with extensive articles detailing the hope of Prague Spring and the tragedy and shock of the invasion. Next slide. Here's the cover of Time magazine for August 30th. The article explains the background and history of Prague Spring, the inevitable march to repress the reform movement, and the outrage of the people around the world for the cynical brutality of the Soviet bloc. The invading soldiers were told that the Czech and Slovak people and the government had asked them for fraternal assistance. Next slide. Here's the cover of Newsweek, September 2nd, 1968. Next slide. The pages are illustrated with scenes of violence and resistance. Next slide. The invasion is explained, and the reaction of the population is shown in these photographs, including one of mine showing the massive protest of Wenceslas Square on August 22nd. Next slide. Here, this is Joseph Koudelka, one of our greatest photographers. In 1968, he was 30 years old and had spent 6 years photographing theater and gypsies. On August 20, 1968, having just returned from Romania, where he photographed the gypsies, he immersed himself in documenting the Warsaw Pact invasion. He took a remarkable series of photographs and managed to have them smuggled out of the country. A year later, they were published by Magnum Photos, attributed to an unknown Czech photographer to avoid reprisal against him and his family. Koudelka took credit for the work only 16 years later, while he was living abroad after the death of his father. His book, Invasion Prague, 1968, was published in 2008, and the amazing photographs have been exhibited around the world. I was thrilled to meet him in Chicago during the opening of a retrospective exhibit of his work. Next slide. Here's a selection of some of his Prague 68 work. This is perhaps one of Koudelka's best-known photographs, poignantly showing his own wristwatch looking up at an empty Wenceslas Square the evening of August 20th, before the invading troops had entered Prague. Next slide. Here's a dramatic shot of an anguished protester and a Soviet soldier on a tank. Next slide. Here are a few more photos taken by Joseph Koudelka. Next slide. Next. Next slide. This is the cover of his book, originally published by Torst in 2008, and subsequently translated into and published in many other languages, including this English version. There are hundreds of photographs in the book, documenting many aspects of the invasion, the resistance, graffiti, brutality, and the sadness of the events. Next slide. This is a cover of my book, published in 2012. Since 2010, we have had shows throughout the United States and in Prague. A number of the pictures are in museums, including the collection of the Chicago Art Institute, the Czech National Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art in Houston, and other collections. Next slide. 23 of my photographs are in this book, authored by Joseph Pizderka, telling the experience of the invasion from the Russian perspective. The book has been published in Czech, Russian, German, and English. Recently discovered photographs taken by Russian soldiers and others were included. This book shows that the views of the Russian people were nuanced and that the issues raised by the invasion were also met with dissent and with resistance at home in Russia. Ultimately, Prague Spring could be seen as the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. On the 50th anniversary of the invasion, I had two shows in Prague, one at the American Embassy and one at Jungmanova Square, a busy square in central Prague with a subway exit. People would come out of the exhibition of 2-meter-high displays and be immersed in the images, bringing new life to the ideals represented by Prague Spring. We had two prior shows in Prague in 2014 and many shows in the US, including New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. At each show, I was approached by Czechs who had lived through Prague Spring and the invasion, recognizing themselves or others, and also students born after 1989. Each of them were touched by the tragedy, humanity, and heroism shown in the photographs. Next slide. On November 17, 1989, student protesters filled the streets of Prague. It was 8 days after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the same tide of freedom that had swept Berlin and come to the Czech capital. Police tried to beat back the demonstrators, hoping to tamp down the demand for freedom, but people seemed to have grown immune to the brutality of the regime. By November 20th, 500,000 Czechs and Slovaks filled Prague streets and took over Wenceslas Square. The communists were forced out. By the end of 1989, Czechoslovakia was on its way to having an elected president for the first time since 1948. Next slide. This was called the Velvet Revolution. From November 17, 1989 to December 29, a transition from one-party communist rule to a parliamentary republic. Václav Havel became the new president of Czechoslovakia, and Alexander Dukchek became Speaker of the Parliament. His call for socialism with a human face and the enduring memory of the Prague Spring was kept alive through the photographic images of protest and resistance. The photographs speak to us today in a world still beset by totalitarianism, autocracy, and repression. Well, thank you for having me here. On so many levels, Prague is now part of my life, and I have been lucky to connect with many extraordinary people interested in the photographs and the history of the wonderful city and its people. Thank you for having me.
Muchísimas gracias, Paul. Impresionantes tus fotografías.
Thank you very much. Your photographs, Paul, are impressive. It's surprising, really surprising to see that these are photographs taken by a 19-year-old who had an elementary knowledge of photography. Is that not the case?
I wouldn't say it was elementary. I had built my own darkroom with my brother, and we had a darkroom in our house. He was a photographer, and I was a photographer in our high school. I had so I had a working knowledge of it, and I was very interested in photography from a young age. But you're right. Certainly, I wasn't a professional photographer, but I had the instincts of a photographer. And in the year that I took off, I had been taking pictures in Vietnam, in Israel, and around. While I was, after I got back, I continued to take photographs of the protests in Berkeley and San Francisco and other events. And had some shows and some other of my photographs were published. But you're right, I was a relatively young person for sure.
Y todas esas otras fotografías.
And all those other pictures, what you did in Vietnam, what you did in the kibbutz in Israel, was the intention also documentary? Did you want to document? Was there a commitment also there in those photographs, the same as in Prague? Could they be a kind of exhibition also, or is it a different thing?
It was quite different. I was mostly trying to just have the experience of being, of traveling and being there. I wasn't really trying to document things so much as to have the experience. I was busy living life and not trying to photograph. I did take some interesting pictures when I was in Cyprus, where I spent a day documenting or farm workers, and but I mostly was just living life. And what happened to me when I got to Prague was something that took over. as I said, I became instinctual and I kind of was compelled to document that in a way I hadn't been before.
Y en el momento de salir de allí.
And when you left Prague, you took your scooter and you went through all those people that were trying to get out of the country. Did you know that you had a treasure with you to offer the agencies, the photographic agency?
I did think I did have significant photographs that I'd taken. Whenever you take, I did not have a light meter. So I was working based, again, on instinct and was hoping that everything I took turned out. And remarkably, I had 5 rolls of film, and out of those 5 rolls of film, I printed over 50 of them. So that's a fairly good representation of good photographs, and they turned out extremely, extremely well. And I did think I had something that was important, and that's one reason I drove all night on the German Autobahn on a Vespa, which was pretty scary.
And once you arrived in, well, you were going to Luxembourg, but you arrived in Frankfurt, did you? And did you have contacts? Who did you go to with these pictures?
I went to AP Press. I have actually thought that AP Press had an office in Nuremberg. And I went to Nuremberg first and realized after doing some research that I had to go to Frankfurt. And literally, I was driving like 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night on the Autobahn, being passed by the Mercedes-Benz going 120 kilometers while I was putting along on my Vespa. But I did not have any contacts. I just kind of thought I'd give it a try, knocked on the door, and about an hour later, they came back out with the contact sheets and circled 5 different photographs that they wanted to buy from me.
Solamente 5.
Only 5. But
only 5.
Did they see? They saw all the material, did they?
Yeah, they saw all of them. There were 5 of them that they decided to purchase. The next morning, I went down to the train station in Frankfurt where they had a newsstand, and the photographs were on the front pages of newspapers from around the world. It was very exciting and an incredible feeling.
Desde luego, para un joven
Of course, for a young photographer, it must have been something quite incredible. And also the fact that you were so committed to what you were doing, because you said you wanted to live, or previously you'd been busy living and you didn't want to document anything. But at the end of the day, you were one of those who documented those events in Prague. I really liked what you said about the characters, the way you approach the characters, the portraits, which people that look quite peaceful sometimes in the pictures. And there's a kind of empathy there in the pictures, I presume because you were also young and they were young. Have you got pictures of the days previous to the invasion, before the invasion, with those young people that you were with in Prague?
Even though I had my camera with me, I was, like I said, I was really more like living my life. There's a funny contradiction when you're a photographer. There's a certain level of discomfort of putting the camera in people's faces instead of just living life. And so I really wasn't focused on taking pictures just for the sake of taking pictures. I was really more interested in experiencing life and, I met the young folks, and we were having beers and having fun and chatting and talking, and they were practicing their English on me. And so it really wasn't my goal in life to come back with a document of my travels. It was more that I just got thrust into the middle of these events, and my instincts took over. There was actually a couple of times during my travels when I felt kind of uncomfortable, because unless you can really become part of a community and be accepted by it, when you're a photographer, there's a certain level of imposition that where you're treating people as subjects, and they may not like it so much. So it can be there's a kind of a conflict between your desire to capture people and perhaps a kind of invasion of their privacy. And so it really wasn't my in that year, this wasn't really my goal to necessarily document everything. As I said, it was really more like the events took over. And then when you're in the middle of an event, people kind of recognize that they're on a stage already. And so you're not really imposing yourself. You're really part of what's happening. So it was different. And it's more comfortable, I think, to take pictures of events than it is to try to document life. That's why I think if you take a look at Kudelka's photographs of the gypsies, is so remarkable, because he was clearly accepted by them. You'll see pictures of him taken with a wide-angle lens of a funeral in a home, and so you could see that he spent years becoming part of that community, and that really speaks to his, I think, beautiful personality and his ability to kind of become part of a community and then come with these just beautiful photographs. And he did the same thing before he took the pictures in Prague. The pictures he took in of the actors and during while he was taking photographs of in Prague were also, again, remarkable. And one of his techniques was to participate in rehearsals and be on stage. So again, he kind of had an ability to immerse himself in these communities. I don't know if I have that talent. I know that I have a certain level of talent, and I was able to document that. And what you said, I appreciate very much. That empathy, I think, does come through in my photographs of particularly the portraits of these faces of the young people, because I think a good photographer sees themselves in their subject.
Yes, of course, it was a baptism of fire, what you did there, and to see those pictures in the international press, what we call it was a rush. Must have been a tremendous rush at the age of 19. How was it possible that you afterwards decided to become a lawyer and to continue with law instead of being a professional photographer?
Well, my father was a lawyer, and he also became a judge. So I grew up in a family that where law was part of our dinner conversation. What cases had been in the court, what were the issues, and at some point in time, I had a variety of different things I could have done. I actually studied biology, because I'd always loved nature and had been always interested in all kinds of things. I had my own beehives. I collected butterflies and turned over rocks to look for salamanders. So I had a lot of different interests. And on top of that, our family, all of our people in our family played music. So I had a very strong interest in music. I had a lot of things I could have done, but for some reason, law kind of appealed to me because it was a challenge for your mind and intellect, and at the same time, an interesting way to interact with people. Plus, it probably pays better than biology.
Eso sí, desde luego.
Yes, of course. We've got a few questions from the audience. Francesc has a question. Perhaps you can answer him. He says,
Sure.
The resistance in Czechoslovakia, was it organized? Were they able to organize resistance against the invasion?
Yes, there was organized. There was definitely an organization. You can tell from taking a look at the photographs that the way the marches were organized around the city in Prague. And there were certain other things that happened where out in the countryside, people would change the direction of the signs to have the troops go in the wrong direction and things like that. At the same time, even though there was perhaps organized resistance, it was really not possible for a small country like Czechoslovakia to effectively resist or fight back. And if you think back upon what happened in Hungary in 1956, when there actually was armed resistance, it was brutally suppressed and a lot of people were killed. And I think the number of people that were killed during the Prague Spring invasion probably was less than 100. Whereas in something like 1956 in Hungary, there were thousands of people killed. So based upon, I think, the history of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, they had been invaded and occupied by so many different people over such a long period of time that while there was resistance, it was more like underground resistance, something that I kind of hinted at earlier, talking about the intellectuals and artists, like filmmakers, like Miloš Forman and other Czech filmmakers. They were subtle resistance that pointed out the alternatives to the one-party rule and the conformity imposed by communism that continued there. And so there was underground resistance all throughout the time period. But at various points in time, it was very, very brutally repressed. I mean, someone like Václav Havel probably spent, I don't know, a total of at least 2 or 3 years in jail for being arrested several times because he would write a play that they didn't like, or sign a petition that opposed repression. So there was resistance, but it was underground and it was constantly repressed.
Uh-huh. Tenemos otra pregunta.
We have another question from Crit Team, who says, thank you, Paul, for sharing your experience with those pictures. And instead of speaking of revolution, your photos show the death of the true revolution, which was the Prague Spring. Do you agree with that? Would you agree with it?
Yes, I do agree. Although I think that the one thing I think that maybe the one thing I was hinting at is that that Prague Spring had and the photographs have a resiliency because they show the spirit of resistance that overcame in the long run the repression that was shown by the invasion. So there's something about, I think, that, as Laura pointed out, if you look at the humanity in the faces, hopefully, I mean, it is a kind of hopeful wish because there's really a balance of power that at the end of the analysis, the world is just as repressive now as it was then, maybe in different ways. If you take a look at what's going on in China and Hong Kong and what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, all of the things that we have to worry about today, the only thing we can hope is that the human faces that we see and the spirit that is represented by that kind of resistance continues. That's why I was so moved by the fact that one of my photographs is in Mahatma Gandhi's house, because that museum is dedicated to the passive resistance over the years. I was also moved by the fact that last year I was contacted by a magazine, the leading photographic magazine in South Korea for their 50th anniversary. They chose my photographs of the invasion as the representation of 1968. And so I think that while the Soviet invasion resulted in quelching of Prague Spring, of suppressing it, the humanitarian passive resistance and the faces that you see there continue to resonate.
Yes, of course. There's no greater icon than a good portrait. We've seen this in this history of revolutions. We've got another question, which Farhan asks, did you fear for your life at any time while you were taking pictures? How did soldiers and the citizens react when you were taking the pictures?
I don't. There were a couple of times when I think I was put myself in a little bit of danger, but at 19 years old, you're not very sensible to these kinds of issues. So I didn't really think about it. I know I would probably be a lot more cautious today, but at that point in time, probably when that Soviet tank commander grabbed my camera and I grabbed it back, that was a place where I put myself in some danger. I was clearly close to people with guns, and the guns, people were shooting them up into the buildings, and some people were being killed, but I didn't feel any particular sense of danger. It was a little tense leaving Czechoslovakia, going across the border. I had put my camera down at the very, very bottom of my backpack, hoping that it wouldn't be discovered. But they were happy to see me go. And so I didn't feel any real danger, but probably mostly because I didn't have the sense to feel it.
We've got Another question. Carla Surjayer says, greetings to everyone. This is fascinating. The story of a young person who lived through those events. I'm not very familiar with them, but when you look at the pictures, they're mostly in black and white. Was it difficult to get color film then, or was it that you didn't want to use color? Wouldn't it have been better to use color had it been possible? What was the issue there?
I only took black and white photographs at that point in my life. If I were to take photographs, they would have been slides. But my favorite film was the Kodak Plus X that I used. And so it just, black and white was the medium I had used throughout my high school career. And that's what I took with me when I traveled. I just didn't think about it. And we were in the age of digital photography. It was a lot different then. You actually had to, have to print your own pictures and develop your own film in a dark room. I had many beautiful hours of working on the portfolio. The darkroom time alone with the radio was really a wonderful time, but black and white was the medium I had always used.
Tenemos otra pregunta de
We've got another question from Francesc. Did you feel again the need to document other conflicts after Prague? Did you feel the need to go to other conflicts and document them?
I did. When I got back to the college, I had to figure out a way to work on my portfolio of photographs because I wanted to print them. And one of the professors at the university, a person named Roland Peterson, had studied photography and also was a painter. And he agreed to sponsor me as to get independent credit to work on my photographs. But he also to do new work. And while in 1968, when I was at school, and in 1969, when I was still working on these things, there were many protests in and around San Francisco and Berkeley of the anti-war movement, and I did document those. I have a lot of photographs of these events. One of the events in Berkeley which is famous, is called the People's Park riot, basically, and I have a lot of photographs of those and other marches and other events, which I again was a participant in, but also documenting at the same time. And actually, I was thinking about this today. If I was younger, I would like to go to Ukraine, and I would find it very interesting to document what's going on there. I was torn between the idea of continuing my the career as a journalist photographer, because it was very exciting what happened to me in Prague. But I had made up my mind earlier that I was going to study biology.
Pero bueno, no.
But
La edad tampoco es un
age is no impediment, Paul. You could go to the Ukraine. You wouldn't take so many risks. I'm sure you wouldn't stand in front of tanks, but I'm sure that you would do very interesting work.
Maybe I'll go to Barcelona and I can document the Catalonian revolution.
Sí, también hay conflictos aquí. También
yes, we have our troubles here. in Cadiz, in the south of Spain, there are harsh and strong protests and clashes with the police. Revolution is very photogenic, don't you think?
I do.
Aesthetically, if you look at it from an artistic point of view and sort of take a distance, move away from it, and it's exciting because you speak of that excitement, and that leads to those pictures that are pictures of for looking at in your lounge at home, in your sitting room, in a magazine. Of course, you're not in the middle of it. You're looking. People are looking at these pictures in magazines in their sitting room, but these pictures transmit that courage and that feeling.
Yeah, there's a strong history of documentation, of going back to Goya, really, when it comes down to it, who was a painter who documented war, and then you take a look at Capra and the other folks that have done photographs of war and protest, and certainly there's intrinsic drama that you put yourself in the middle of. Of course, at the same time, you're putting yourself in some degree of danger. I got arrested when I was in Berkeley, taking pictures because there was an event where the police were beating a young man and in front of his girlfriend for doing nothing, and I was taking pictures of the whole series of events, and I yelled at them to stop, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground with someone standing on my neck, and they'd opened up my camera and destroyed my film. So you take some risks when you're documenting this. That people don't like it. You can see that photojournalists and other journalists have been the victims of violence and killings throughout the world.
Tenemos otra, bueno, no es una pregunta, es una apreciación de María Antonia Minguet, que nos dice muchas gracias por tus fotografías y por explicar tus vivencias desde el principio de tu salida del instituto. Perdón.
There's another question from someone who says, thank you very much for your experience and for your pictures.
Adelante.
No, está bien, vale. Bueno, pues
as I was saying, there's a question that asks and that expresses the speaker's admiration, and she says, this person who's asking the question, that you seem to take focus special attention on the faces of people, as we've said. And the fact that, for instance, you took that picture of that old man walking along the street, and he looks as if he's some kind of intellectual, a wise old man who's full of experience. And that is in contrast with you, who were so young, and you took pictures like the one of that wise old man. This is a comment. This person was struck by all these different things, the faces, the contrast, etc. We have no further questions, but I do have a question which I'd like to ask you. I was surprised by what you were saying just now about your experience with conflict, with war, with revolutions and protests in the US, for instance. Didn't you ever think about a publication that included all that work that you did in your home country, in the US, in California, Berkeley, etc.?
Not really. Like I said, my photographs have been kind of sitting in a drawer in my study, and the Prague photographs are frankly probably the strongest group that I have of work. They really document very succinctly the history of the invasion of Prague, and I think that as some of the questioners have pointed out, I think they have a unique kind of focus from an American perspective of what was happening. Besides Joseph Kudelka, my pictures are probably the best collection of what happened at that point in time. So they are sort of unique. There are a lot of pictures of what happened in Berkeley and in other places. I think certainly I could see at some point in time trying to put some of those together with the Prague photographs to illustrate some other aspects of my career as a photographer, and having a retrospective. But I don't think I have the portfolio because I didn't have the focus. My focus was elsewhere. And right now I take my pictures on my iPhone of mushrooms and puppy dogs, and the things that other people do. But I do see there's potential for some of putting together some other photographs that would complement my Prague photographs.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for your lecture, for your talk, and for this generosity that you've shown us in showing and sharing your work with us. I hope you like the experience and to share with us all these experiences that I imagine, and I suppose that to relive them when you look at the pictures and to speak about those times, I suppose it is rather moving for you. And for us, it has really been a true experience, and especially it's been a compliment to all these other revolutions that we've been looking at in this series, where we see how over time the way of experiencing these events changes. In your case, we come across a photographer who is a vital artist who bases his work on experience and then shares his experience through photography. And this is the first experience of this kind that we've had in this series of lectures. And to say goodbye, I don't know whether you want to add anything. And if not, we can say goodbye, I think.
Laura, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me and for your interest in the pictures. It is really my honor to be able to participate and share them with you and with the public. And I feel that I'm very lucky to have had the chance to have them seen on this broader stage and to have your interest in them.
Seguro que sí, además quedará colgada.
Yes, I'm sure. And also this lecture will be up on the web for those who want to revisit it and those who want to, or who haven't been able to be here today to follow it today. And for everybody else, thank you very much for your attention and your questions. Next week, we will have two conferences, two lectures. We'll have two. And then The audience in Barcelona, will be happy to know that they'll be in person. You will be able to come here physically. So we'll meet again at the Photography Center, KBR, at the Mapfre Foundation in Barcelona. For those of you who can't be here in person, we'll also be online, and you can follow this on the internet, online. And on the 30th, Tuesday, the 30th of November, we'll have Pepe Baeza, who will speak about the Carnation Revolution of 1974 in Portugal that overthrew the political regime in Portugal. And then on the 2nd of December, Thursday, we'll have Cristina Vives from Havana, who will give us a lecture on the Cuban Revolution. And those of you who cannot join us physically, well, we'll see you online, and all the others on the 27th. We'll see you again at the Photography Center, the KBR. Maybe we can have a beer afterwards. Thank you very much, and a great hug to you all. Thank you very much, Paul. Enjoy your day in California.
Thank you, Laura. I hope to see you in Barcelona.